Resigned Friday after allegations that he asked a staffer to be a surrogate. A prominent conservative who has counseled the woman tells CNN that Congressman Franks offered the staffer $5 million if she successfully conceived his child. Franks is one of the 3 lawmakers to resign last week after women stepped forward to say that the men had sexually harassed him. Eliana, every time I read that sentence, it is one of the most bizarre stories, I think, to come out, period. I mean,
it just coming to me on
and so, I mean, tell me about Capitol Hill. Tell me about sort of the reactions on Capitol Hill around this, and this sense that this could be the tip of the iceberg there.
Well, this is a jaw-dropping story, and
unprecedented.
I think it's obviously pretty unlikely that we'll see something like this. But that being said, I do think it's undeniable that reporters on Capitol Hill, lawmakers on Capitol Hill are bracing for other sexual harassment allegations, and that the Democratic Party this week essentially sacrificed Senator Al Franken at the altar of politics in order to prepare themselves and to arm themselves in this fight. And they are getting ready to be able to prosecute the case that they occupy the moral high ground, getting ready for Roy Moore perhaps to be elected, and to say that they are taking a completely no-tolerance position from groping to rape. They won't tolerate it, and really to put Republicans on the ropes.
And this was Franken this past week from the Senate floor talking about his resignation from the Senate.
There is some irony in the fact that I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office, and a man who has repeatedly preyed on young girls campaigns for the Senate with the full support of his party.
So Eliana talked about this moral high ground that Democrats want to stake out. It's a hard place to be, and sometimes it's a squishy place to be as well. If you think about it, there are still some members on the Democratic side who have some allegations against them.
Yeah, I mean, and you saw a shift this past week. I mean, Capitol Hill had been very slow to respond to all these allegations in a way that Hollywood was not. The media has not been. In terms of when these allegations come forward, people tend to lose their jobs fairly quickly. So this week was different in that sense, where now the cascading has started. And it's kind of unclear where that leads. But to Eliana's point, the Democrats are trying to claim the moral high ground here, where they did not wait for the Ethics Committee investigation to conclude. Women, particularly Democratic women, came forward and said it's time for Al Franken to go. And that sort of is what caused, I mean, Franken did not apologize or admit to anything in his speech, aside from the fact that he can't do his job anymore because Democrats
and was
won't
emotional
work with him.
and almost
Schumer said he can't do his job anymore.
Nor did he apologize.
He didn't really
to any,
apologize, right?
Yeah. But I do think this is a moment to sort of give credit where credit is due on the Republican side, and it certainly does seem sparse at this moment of Roy Moore. But the Senatorial Committee still is not getting back in. They're not backing Roy Moore. Cory Gardner was out there giving interviews this week in which he made it very clear that he doesn't believe Roy Moore belongs in the Senate, and he believes he should be expelled. Now, this is a sliver of Republicans who are standing up still to Roy Moore. We've seen Mitch McConnell essentially say whatever the voters of Alabama are going to do, they're going to do, mimicking what Trump has been saying. But there are some Republicans who are still trying to stake out a moral high ground, but it might be a little lonely.
Yeah, and we had Paul Ryan talk about what's going on now. Here's what he had to say about this moment.
In addition to just better policies to protect women, we also need a real culture change. We need to recognize that this is a pervasive problem that women face not just here in Congress, but through every industry. And this really is a watershed moment, and it needs to lead to lasting and positive change.
So, Manu, you cover the Hill. It's one thing to say this is a watershed moment. It's another thing to do the kind of watershed work necessary to actually make it a watershed moment. What are folks on the Hill prepared to do? It seems like so far it's kind of a case-by-case basis.
It has been, and there's discussion about overhauling the process, particularly on the Hill, which right now is convoluted and secretive in terms of, excuse me, actually filing these complaints and holding some of these members accountable, the public does not know what happens. There's taxpayer money that's spent to settle these cases. We don't know where these settlements are going. Some of these are starting to leak out. There's going to be an effort to try to change that, to make it more transparent. There's some members who want to see all the settlements that have happened over the last
That's $17 million. That's part of that.
That's part of the sexual harassment. So the question is, does any of that become public? I think we are starting to see leaks make that public, and that's putting some pressure on members like Congressman Farenthold, who's in Paul Ryan's conference, who is not yet resigning, but is facing some pressure among some of his colleagues to step aside after reports of his making a settlement in that regard. And you're seeing some other members decide not to step aside either, like Reuben Kuhn, who's a Democratic congressman from Nevada in a swing state district in that state. He's facing calls from Pelosi to step down. He's not doing it.
He's been very defiant.
He's been defiant. So you're going to see some of these play out in a rather messy way as well.
And Eliana, there ultimately is only so much that leaders can do short of expulsion, which we haven't really seen in any great length since the Civil War.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to watch. I think Farenthold face pressure from his colleagues and Democratic Congressman Kuhn, and whether they eventually bow to the pressure. But we've seen them get increasingly creative with their defensives. Kuhn's defense was particularly amusing, saying that Nancy Pelosi and other Democratic leaders were aware of his behavior, and as a result, he shouldn't have to step down.
And Farenthold has said he will pay back the money.
Exactly. So, it's all good.
We'll see how long that they can maintain that stance, and also you imagine,
particularly if new cases emerge.
Right.
I mean, I think
I'm sure you're talking to sources, and the sense is that there probably will be other cases. Maybe there'll be strength in numbers or something. We'll see. Up next, 2 former Trump advisors, hundreds of thousands of documents, and they're all in the hands of prosecutors involved in the Russia investigation. The court appearance comes as prosecutors delve into a massive trove of evidence involving Paul Manafort and Rick Gates. Here's what Bob Mueller's investigators have collected by the numbers. They have 400,000 documents. Now, 2,000 of those documents have been labeled as hot by investigators. And there's also information from 36 electronic devices, including laptops, phones, and thumb drives. And so far, Mueller's team has obtained 15 search warrants. Prosecutors also revealed some of the emails between Manafort and Gates about ways to combat political attacks over Manafort's foreign lobbying work. According to the court filings, they discussed how to frame Manafort's work in Ukraine, suggesting that he, quote, never worked in Russia or for the Russians, and that for his other work, they, quote, need to beat back the idea that this was nefarious work. Manu, what is Mueller after here in this documents? This is an investigation that's gone on for about 5 months, cost $7 million. What is he up to?
Well, look, obviously, there's several efforts here. There's one to build the case against Manafort and Gates in court. These are part of documents that are going to be turned over as part of the discovery process. The other side will have a sense on knowing exactly what they have. But it also shows really the aggressiveness of Bob Mueller's investigation. We have known for some time that this has been an exceptionally, or rather aggressive investigation. They have really done what they can to try to turn over every leaf here. Clearly, they have an enormous amount of information that did not appear in the initial court filings that they know about, that presumably could fuel their investigation in other ways to look into other people. And we do know that Hope Hicks, the White House communications director, also was interviewed by the special counsel. This investigation is still ongoing. There's still more people that are interviewing, even though Gates and Manafort are going to be in court tomorrow. There's a lot more people that the special counsel has to interview, and we'll see where it goes. It could go a lot of different directions.
It certainly goes with Trump wherever he goes. He was in Florida, and it in some ways came up in chance from some of his supporters, and then his response.
Look, it's being proven we have a rigged system. Doesn't happen so easy. But this system, going to be a lot of changes. This is a rigged system. This is a sick system from the inside.
Sarah, you've been to a lot of Trump rallies. Lock her up. A familiar refrain, a little ironic at this point. Often it was led by Michael Flynn, who's facing some of his own issues here. What do you make of what's going on there? It seems to be Trump trying to, in some ways, talk about the deep state and discredit what's going on.
Yeah, well, first of all, that catchphrase kind of came back around to bite.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I don't think that it should be a surprise to us at this point that the president is still stewing over the Russia investigation, that he believes is unfair. He has called it a witch hunt. So sure, I mean, the rigged state could be, rigged system could be referring to the deep state. It could be referring to the investigation. You know, it could be referring to a lot of things, but we know that this is something that the president can't move past, and that he does feel like it has an actual impact on his ability to do his job. He felt like it was the kind of thing that could undermine his relationships with foreign leaders when he was abroad, make it harder to strike deals with them, but he also believes that it's the kind of thing that makes it harder for him to just get legislation done in Washington, because people are so focused on the Russia investigation. And of course, you don't need to look any further than his Twitter account to understand his frustration with this.
And this week we heard from a family member of someone involved in the Russia investigation, George Papadopoulos' fiancé.
George Papadopoulos has everything but a coffee boy. I think they wanted to dissociate from the first person who decided to actively cooperate with the government on the right side. And probably the easiest way out is to dismiss his personality and lower him to a low-level volunteer.
Why, in some ways? I mean, I guess she wants to get out there and say her man wasn't a coffee boy.
I mean, she's not the most unbiased source on this either, right? I mean,
right.
So far, we've heard from Trump and you know, his advisors sort of downplaying Papadopoulos and his role. So now we have the fiancé saying, no, he's a really important guy and in the campaign. So, I mean, I think this gets back to Mueller and why his investigation is so key and why he's seems being fairly thorough in requesting documents and having interviews. And, you know, there's just this cast of players here.
Yeah.
And Papadopoulos, and you got Flynn and Hope Hicks, you know, which is that I think is a very key interview with Hope Hicks, because as we know, she is so close to the president. Circle. She's been there throughout the campaign and throughout the White House, which you can't say for many people who've been around Trump. They play these bit parts and then they're out of the orbit, whereas Hope has been there throughout.
You can say that for Don Jr., who also talked to folks on the Hill, and here is some comments about what he said and whether or not he's been forthcoming.
He has a very serious case of amnesia, and he was pretty non-responsive on a lot of issues that, frankly, you would have a recollection of, considering it was just a year ago that many of these events took place when Donald Trump was the candidate. He was by his father's side, he was campaigning with his father, and you get the impression in listening to him that he didn't spend much time talking with his father.
Questions, Eliana, there about the June 2016 meeting. Apparently, in some of his testimony there, in statements, he claimed attorney-client privilege.
Yes. Let me address the Papadopoulos thing for one second. I mean, it's not really a matter of opinion. I don't think, you know, all of us covered the campaign, and I think it's fair to say he was not an integral player in the campaign. Doesn't mean he was a coffee boy, but he was a member of the Foreign Policy Advisory Committee that itself was kind of a mess and was not central to the Trump campaign. But Donald Trump Jr., on the other hand, was a central player on the campaign, and the fact that he is citing an absurd, you know, attorney-client privilege because there was an attorney present in the room does seem ridiculous on its face. That being said,
in some ways, but,
I mean, it seems like a desperate measure to avoid answering questions, which is somewhat troubling if, as he and the president say, this meeting was completely inconsequential.
And the question of the attorney-client privilege thing is whether or not Donald Trump Jr. will eventually tell that committees exactly what happened there, because apparently he did tell both sides that he's willing to go back and look and discuss this with his attorneys if he can share this information. So the Republicans on the committee so far are saying, well, let's let them discuss this first before we push it. That's what Mike Conaway told me last week.
See if he comes back.
We'll see if he at least tells the committee what happened. Yeah, we'll see.
Okay, we'll see. Coming up for us, a promise made, a promise kept. We're taking stock of some of the president's biggest campaign promises. Has he lived up to this memorable promise?
I'm very good for jobs. In fact, I will be the greatest president for jobs that God ever created. That I can tell you. I'm very strong on jobs and the economy.
401k is doing not too bad, right? We've created 2.2 million new jobs. Factories are coming back to our country. We have factories pouring back into our country. You ever think you'd hear that? I used to tell you that's going to happen. Consumer confidence is at a 17-year high. Think of that. It was not like that in your last administration.
That was President Trump on Friday night, reminding the crowd that in case they missed it, the economy is booming and things are going awesome. By many measures, he's actually right. Unemployment is at a 17-year low. The stock market is at record highs. And for the first time, it appears that Americans are starting to agree with the president about who deserves the credit. According to a new numbers from Quinnipiac University, just as many Americans now credit President Trump with the state of the economy as President Obama. And for President Trump, he was there on Friday and fresh off of the Twitters this morning. He's tweeting about his accomplishments. He had this to say: things are going really well for our economy, a subject the fake news spends as little time as possible discussing. Stock market hit another record high. Unemployment is now at a 17-year low, and companies are coming back into the USA. Really good news and much more to come. Also tweeted about the tax cut bill, getting closer and closer on the tax cut bill, shaping up even better than projected. House and Senate working very hard and smart. End result will not only be important, but special. Special indeed. Matt, I'm going to go to you. You wrote a special article on Donald Trump and the promises he's made. And one of the sentences from your article, you said, in deeds, if not in words, he's proved a lot more billionaire and a lot less blue collar. Talk about what you've seen from this president over these many months.
Yeah, I mean, he came into office on a very populist message, and that quote was in reference to his son, Donald Trump Jr., frequently calling him a blue-collar billionaire. You know, and he did kind of adopt that sort of style on the campaign, talking about the forgotten men and women of America, and he was going to lift them up. And I mean, no doubt the economy is doing well, but the question a lot of times is who is it doing well for? And in the tax bill and in a lot of the things that he has done as president in his governing style has benefited more of the wealthy than it has the middle class. And so I think this notion of him being a populist as a governing president is not true. You know, and he hasn't necessarily lived up to a lot of that aspect.
Right. One of the things he also promised was to be the world's greatest deal maker, and here he was talking about deals that are coming up in terms of avoiding a government shutdown and funding the government.
We're all here as a very friendly, well-unified group. It's a well-knit together group of people, and we hope that we're going to make some great progress for our country.
So we're here in the spirit of let's get it done.
We are here to make progress.
We're here to reach a bipartisan agreement to finish out the year.
Glad we're here to resume conversations.
I'm grateful for the leaders of both political parties.
And that was bipartisan Trump in some ways. Here was partisan Trump just the next day.
It's time for Democrats in Congress to drop the threats of shutdowns of government and support a clean appropriations bill that fully supports and funds our military. We can't play games anymore.
And Sarah, in the deal around funding the government, not only can he prove maybe to be a good deal maker, but there are also some promises he can keep, right? I mean, if in fact there's a wall in there, if there's increased funding in terms of the military, what are you hearing in terms of the strategy?
Well, look, I think this is kind of an interesting moment for the president because the last time he struck a deal with Chuck and Nancy, as he likes to say, he caught a lot of criticism from Republicans who said, look, you basically just took what they brought into the room.
You gave away the story,
to it. And so the president is at sort of a different point mentally. He's been thinking a lot more about shoring up his base and protecting the promises he made to the people who brought him into office. He's also been thinking about that Kate Steinle case, the fact that the person who went to trial in her murder has been
the radio address, I think, from this week was about
guilty.
that.
So I think these are all elements in the president's brain right now as he's trying to push for things like wall funding. He may be sort of less willing to back down on some of these issues than he was just a few months ago.
And Manu, how much of to borrow a phrase from Dan Balz, how much of a hot mess could this be? The kind of deal making that'll have to go on.
You know, the question here is how they deal with the next deadline, which is December 22nd. When, if they don't reach a deal, the government will shut down. They were all talking nice at the White House to essentially lead to a 2-week agreement. To keep the government for 2 weeks.
Bravo.
Right. They did that. The question is the next time around. And most likely, the expectation is probably yet another short-term extension into the next year because of immigration being such a hot issue. Democrats want to deal with dealing with these DACA, these dreamers coming into the country, who came into the country at a young age. They're not going to be able to do it the year-end spending bill. That means that their deadline is for March to deal with them. That means that they're going to have to probably agree to a short-term bill so they can attach this onto a funding bill next February instead.
Punt.
Punt. That's probably what's going to end up happening here. We'll see if the president gets his wall money, because right now Democrats say they won't vote for that.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes. It does sound like a hot mess. And Eliana, I want to ask you this, and you've written about this. He did make news on Israel. Quickly talk about that.
The president,
and that was one of his promises.
Absolutely, he did fulfill a major campaign promise. Interestingly, it's been a campaign promise of most Republican and Democratic presidents to declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel and to move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Trump actually did it earlier this week, and pushing back against the advice of most of his advisors in something that played out very similar to his decision to decertify the Iran deal.
And this evangelical's very happy about that, of course, a big part of his base. Our reporters share from their notebooks next to tell you what they're hearing from their sources, including a headline about President Trump's deputy national security advisor's exit and the key question behind her departure.
Well, we learned this week that Tina Powell, the president's deputy national security advisor, is going to be leaving the White House after about a year serving there. Now, we expect that she's probably the beginning of what's going to be a wave of departures. Not unusual in any administration, but certainly in a tumultuous Trump White House, this wave could be even bigger. But one thing to watch is not just who is leaving, but how does the White House fill these positions? This administration has struggled since day one to staff its West Wing, and that certainly isn't getting any easier as the Russia investigation looms even larger over the Trump White House.
We'll see where that goes and what kind of new faces we'll see around the White House. Matt.
There's been a lot of chatter about Orrin Hatch and what he's going to do. There are some signs pointing to him deciding to run for re-election. He's got President Trump in his ear, pushing him to do so. He's got a fundraiser scheduled for January, but time is almost up for him to make a decision. So watch that, and also watch Mitt Romney. He has been much rumored to want that seat if Hatch does not run. But if Hatch decides to run, Romney still wants a role, and so watch him and sort of what he may do if Hatch runs.
In that conflict between Mitt Romney and Donald Trump, it's real. Yeah. Manu.
A big question this week is what will Devin Nunes do in the Russia investigation on the House side? The chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, he had stepped aside in April amid concerns that he may have mishandled classified intelligence. This after he went to the White House, briefed the president on concerns that he had about whether or not individuals were improperly unmasked in intelligence reports. But on Thursday, the House Ethics Committee cleared him of any wrongdoing. So now the big question among members is, what will he do? Will he come back and take charge of this investigation that he had stepped aside and he let Mike Conaway, the Republican of Texas, run it? Now, for months, Nunes has quietly wielded influence behind the scenes. He's retained subpoena power, and he's launched his own investigations, but what he has not done is attended these classified hearings. He also has led the negotiations over what witnesses to come, Conaway and the top Democrat in the committee, Adam Schiff. So the question is, if he does decide now to run the investigation, how will that impact things? Democrats undoubtedly would be upset about that. It could further inflame tensions in this already very partisan committee.
Yeah, we'll look for how that resolves itself. Eliana.
In mid-November, when the White House was first asked to respond to the allegations leveled against Roy Moore by several women, they put out a statement. Then the president was in Asia, and the first line of that statement said that, like most Americans, the president doesn't believe that mere allegations, in this case decades old, should be allowed to ruin somebody's life and career. And recently, White House aides have indicated to me that that first line of that statement really does represent the president's true feelings about Roy Moore, but also kind of this broader wave of sexual harassment allegations. And I think it helps to explain the shift we've seen in the president's stance on Moore and his candidacy, but also may preview some comments that we may see him make and sort of a broader wave of sexual harassment allegations that we've seen coming out of Congress and, in broader American life.
That'll be interesting to watch as well. That's it for Inside Politics today. Thanks for sharing some of your Sunday with us. Jake Tapper is next with an exclusive interview with Senator Richard Shelby from Alabama, with more on that Senate showdown between Roy Moore and Doug Jones. State of the Union is up right after the break.
Choose to go, to indulge your curiosity, explore a new road,